My biological parents gave me up for adoption at age 10, the moment I inherited a fortune, all because I was a girl. 19 years later, they came back demanding their share, so I used the clever trap my great-aunt left behind to ensure they never bothered me again. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day already heavy with the sort of damp, gray weariness that sinks into your bones. I was sitting at my desk, the polished mahogany cool beneath my forearms, staring at a spreadsheet detailing grant proposals for a new literacy program. My head throbbed with a persistent, low-grade ache, the remnant of a weekend spent battling a nasty flu. The foundation I ran, built from the ground up with a legacy I never asked for, demanded my full attention even when my body begged for rest. It was my purpose, my shield, and on days like this, my burden. My assistant, a wonderfully efficient young woman named Chloe, placed the mail on the corner of my desk with a soft clink of her bracelet. "Just the usual, Emma," she said, her voice gentle. "Bills, a few donor acknowledgments, and this one." She tapped a single, cream-colored envelope. It stood out from the sterile white of the business mail like a ghost. It bore no return address, only my name, Miss Emma Sterling, written in a looping, vaguely familiar cursive. A chill, entirely unrelated to my lingering fever, traced a path down my spine. The name was a relic, a title I hadn't used since I was a child. To the world, and more importantly to myself, I was Emma Miller. My real name, the name given to me by the parents who had chosen me, loved me, and raised me. I slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener, a gift from my father, my real father, David Miller, for my 25th birthday. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and smelled faintly of a cloying, old-fashioned perfume I distantly recognized. The handwriting matched the envelope, elegant but strained. "My dearest Emma," the letter began. The words swam before my eyes. My heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of pure dread. There were only two people in the world who would address me this way. "It has been many years, 19 to be exact, and not a single day has passed that we have not thought of you. We know we made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. We were young, foolish, and overwhelmed by circumstances we couldn't understand. We have lived with the shame and regret of our decision every moment since you left. We are older now, and hopefully wiser, and our only wish is to see our daughter again. To explain, to ask for your forgiveness." The letter was signed, "With deepest love and regret, your mother and father, Margaret and Richard Sterling." I dropped the paper as if it were on fire. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. The words seemed to mock me from the plush carpet. Your mother and father. The title was a lie, a hollow claim to a relationship they had willingly, almost eagerly, severed. They weren't my parents. They were my creators, the people who had brought me into the world and then discarded me the moment I became an inconvenience, or more accurately, the moment my inheritance made them irrelevant. The story was the kind of strange, sad tale that sounds like fiction. My great-aunt Isabella, my maternal grandmother's sister, had been a brilliant, fiercely independent woman who built a formidable business empire from nothing. She had no children of her own and had always been fond of me, the quiet, bookish child who preferred listening to her stories about stocks and hostile takeovers over playing with dolls. My parents, Richard and Margaret, had always assumed they were her heirs. They fawned over her, catered to her every whim, their greed thinly veiled by a veneer of familial devotion. But Aunt Isabella was no one's fool. She saw through their cloying affection and recognized their deep-seated disappointment in having a daughter instead of a son to carry on the Sterling name. So when she passed away, she left her entire fortune, a staggering sum, in a trust for me. Me alone. The will was ironclad, its primary stipulation being that the funds would be managed by a neutral third party until my 25th birthday. My parents would not see a dime. Their reaction was swift and brutal. Within 6 months of the will being read, they had surrendered their parental rights. They told the social worker I was a difficult child and that they couldn't cope. The truth was simpler. They couldn't stand to look at me, this 10-year-old girl who held the keys to a kingdom they could never enter. The fortune was tied to me, and since they couldn't get the money, they got rid of the girl. I was adopted a year later by the Urs, a warm, loving couple who had been trying for a child for years. They gave me a home, a sense of security, and a love so unconditional it slowly began to heal the gaping wound of my abandonment. They were my parents in every way that mattered. Richard and Margaret were nothing more than a bad memory, a ghost story I rarely told. And now, the ghosts were knocking at my door. I stared at the letter, my breath catching in my throat. Their words were smooth, practiced, filled with all the right sentiments of remorse. But I could feel the cold calculation beneath the surface. They didn't want me. They never had. They wanted what I had. After 19 years of silence, 19 years of letting me believe I was so worthless they'd thrown me away, they had come back. My fluid-ridden body felt suddenly weak, the room tilting slightly. The betrayal was worse than the abandonment itself. The days following the letter's arrival were a blur of forced normalcy. I went to work, I chaired meetings, I reviewed financial reports, all while a storm raged inside me. My adoptive parents, David and Sarah Miller, were on a long-planned anniversary cruise in Alaska, blessedly out of cell range. I was grateful for that. I didn't want to ruin their trip with this specter from the past. I needed to handle it, or at least understand it, on my own first. The letter included a phone number. For 3 days, I stared at it, the digits burning into my memory. Part of me, a small, wounded child part I thought long buried, wanted to hear their voices, to hear them say the words they'd written. But the logical, adult part of me, the woman who ran a multi-million-dollar foundation, knew it was a trap. Their reappearance wasn't random. It was a calculated move. Something had to have prompted it. On the 4th day, my curiosity won. My hands were trembling as I dialed the number. A man answered on the 2nd ring, his voice smooth and deep, a voice I hadn't heard since I was 10 but recognized instantly. Richard Sterling speaking. "It's Emma," I said, my own voice coming out thin and reedy. There was a pause, a beat of what I assumed was feigned surprise. "Emma? Oh, my dear girl, we were so hoping you'd decall. Your mother is right here. Margaret, it's her. It's Emma." I could hear muffled, excited sounds in the background before Margaret came on the line, her voice a cascade of saccharine emotion. "Oh, darling. Emma, is it really you? We've dreamed of this moment. We were so afraid you'd hate us, that you wouldn't want to speak to us." The performance was flawless. They spoke of sleepless nights, of endless regret, of how they followed my career from afar with so much pride. They painted a picture of 2 young parents crushed by grief and financial pressure, making a decision they thought was for the best. It was a masterpiece of revisionist history. They never asked about my life, not really. They didn't ask about the Millers, about my friends, about my happiness. Their questions were a thin veneer over their true interest. "That foundation you run," Richard said, his tone casual, "it must be so much work. Managing all of Isabella's assets." The way he said our great-aunt's name, with a familiar mix of reverence and resentment, sent a shiver down my spine. That was the core of it all. The money. I kept the call brief, making a vague promise to think about meeting them. The moment I hung up, the facade of strength I had maintained crumbled. I felt nauseous. Their voices, so full of false warmth, hadn't soothed the wounded child inside me. They had terrified her. The practiced ease of their lies confirmed my deepest fears. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was an invasion. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was plagued by fragmented memories of my childhood with them. The way my father's face would tighten whenever I brought home a good report card, as if my success was a personal affront. The way my mother would sigh dramatically when I asked for a new book, complaining about expenses, even though they were never short of money. They were cold, distant people, experts in the art of making a child feel like a burden. And then another memory surfaced, clearer and sharper than the rest. It was from a few weeks before Aunt Isabella's death. She was visiting, her presence filling our sterile house with a rare warmth. She'd taken me aside, her kind, wrinkled eyes serious. "You are a clever girl, Emma," she had said, her hand on my shoulder. "Much clever than they think. Remember that. Some people see value only in money, but true strength is in character. and I've made sure you'll always have the means to protect yours." Her words echoed in my mind, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of my emotions. "I've made sure you'll always have the means to protect yours." She must have known what they were, what they would do. My great-aunt hadn't just left me a fortune, she had left me armor. As I lay in the dark, a new feeling began to displace the fear and the hurt, a cold, hard resolve. Richard and Margaret were playing a game, one they had started 19 years ago. They had made their move. Now, it was my turn. They had forgotten one crucial thing. They thought they were dealing with the confused, heartbroken 10-year-old girl they had thrown away. They were about to find out how wrong they were. To understand the depth of Richard and Margaret's betrayal, you have to understand the life they gave me and the life I found after them. My early childhood was a lesson in emotional austerity. The Sterling house was immaculate, a museum of polished surfaces and perfectly arranged furniture where nothing was ever out of place, including its inhabitants. Affection was a currency they rarely spent. My father, Richard, was a man obsessed with legacy and appearances. He was the junior partner in a small investment firm and carried himself with the unearned gravitas of a titan of industry. Dee wanted a son, an heir to carry the Sterling name to glory. What he got was me, a quiet daughter who preferred the company of books to the social climbing he valued. His disappointment was a constant, unspoken presence in our home. My mother, Margaret, was his loyal second in command. Her domain was social standing. She chaired committees, hosted joyless dinner parties, and judged everyone by the value of their assets and the prestige of their connections. She treated me like an accessory that didn't quite match her outfit, to be kept clean, presentable, and silent. The sacrifices they made for me were purely material. The best schools, expensive clothes, lessons in piano and ballet that I dreaded. They were investments in the image of a perfect family, and I was a poor return. My only refuge was Great-Aunt Isabella. She would sweep into our cold house like a warm summer wind, smelling of expensive perfume and adventure. She was everything my parents were not, vibrant, curious, and genuinely interested in me. She saw my quiet nature not as a failing, but as a sign of a rich inner world. She brought me books on historical figures, taught me how to play chess, and spoke to me as an equal. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Emma," she would say, her eyes twinkling. "Especially not small-minded people." She was my champion, and her death felt like the extinguishing of the only light in my life. When her will was read, my parents' coldness curdled into something uglier. The shock on their faces was terrifying. They had been so certain. In the weeks that followed, the house became unbearable. They'd have hushed, furious arguments behind closed doors. They looked at me with open resentment, as if I had personally orchestrated this grand theft of their destiny. Then came the day they sat me down in the pristine living room and told me in calm, measured tones that I would be going to live with a new family. "It's for the best," my father said, not meeting my eyes. "We can't give you what you need." What I needed, of course, was to not be the living embodiment of their greatest disappointment. The contrast when I met David and Sarah Miller was like stepping from a black-and-white film into Technicolor. Their home was cozy, filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of laughter, and the happy clutter of a life well lived. They were a teacher and a carpenter, people who built things with their hands and their hearts. They hugged me on that first day, a real, enveloping hug that made the frightened 10-year-old inside me want to weep. They saw the fortune not as a prize or a complication, but as a responsibility they would help me prepare for. They nurtured my love of learning, celebrated my achievements, and most importantly, taught me that family was not an accident of birth, but a conscious act of love. They were, and are, my parents. Now, staring at the number for the Sterling family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, I felt the strength the Millers had given me solidifying into a plan. Aunt Isabella had trusted this man to manage her estate and protect her wishes. He was the keeper of her secrets. Mr. Abernathy, now a grandfatherly man with kind eyes and a sharp mind, remembered me instantly. "Emma, my goodness, it's been years. I trust you are well." "I am, thank you, Mr. Abernathy," I said, getting straight to the point. I've had some recent contact from my biological parents. A heavy sigh came through the phone. I see. I confess, I always wondered if this day would come. Let me guess. They are deeply remorseful and only want to reconnect with their long-lost daughter. The accuracy of his guess was chilling. Word for word, I confirmed. They are laying the groundwork to ask for money. I can feel it. I'm sure you can, he said grimly. Richard and Margaret were always transparent in their motivations, which is why your great aunt was so brilliantly proactive. Emma, Isabella was a remarkable woman. She foresaw this. She knew their character, and she built a fortress around you and your inheritance. My heart beat a little faster. This was it. She left more than just a will, he continued. She created the Isabella Sterling Trust, a document of breathtaking legal complexity. And within that trust, there is a very specific, very powerful provision. We always referred to it as the prodigal clause. He explained it to me, and as he did, I felt a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. The betrayal of my parents was a deep and lasting wound, but Aunt Isabella, from beyond the grave, had handed me the perfect suture. The prodigal clause, as Mr. Abernathy called it, was a work of legal genius. It was a behavioral clause tied directly to Richard and Margaret Sterling. It stated that while they were not to be considered beneficiaries of the trust, their well-being was, in a vague sense, to be monitored. However, it came with a venomous sting. If, at any point, they were found to have engaged in actions of coercion, manipulation, or public defamation against me with the intent of financial gain, or if they launched any formal legal challenge to the trust itself, the clause would be triggered. Triggering it had two effects. First, it would legally and permanently sever any and all of their theoretical claims to the estate, no matter how tenuous. Second, and this was Isabella's masterstroke, it would empower the trust's board, of which I was now the head, to release a public statement detailing the reason for the clause's activation, effectively exposing their behavior to the world. It was a defensive weapon and a character assassination tool rolled into one. It wasn't just a shield. It was a trap, baited and waiting for their greed to spring it. Your great-aunt wanted you to have peace of mind, Mr. Abernathy concluded. She knew that if they ever came back, it wouldn't be for you. This clause ensures that you have the power to end it definitively on your terms. Armed with this knowledge, I shifted from a passive victim of their reappearance to an active strategist. The wounded child was still there, but the foundation director was now in charge. My first move was to hire a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by Mr. Abernathy's firm. I wanted to know everything. What was Richard and Margaret's financial situation? What had prompted them to contact me now, after 19 years of silence? While the investigator, a no-nonsense man named Peterson, got to work, I agreed to a tentative lunch with Richard and Margaret. I chose a busy, neutral restaurant downtown. I needed to see them to gauge the sincerity of their performance for myself. Seeing them walk towards the table was a surreal experience. Age had softened Richard's sharp features, but hadn't touched the arrogance in his eyes. Margaret was still impeccably dressed, her smile as bright and brittle as glass. They looked like a perfectly respectable, affluent couple. The lunch was a masterclass in manipulation. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief as she spoke of the unbearable guilt they had lived with. Richard spoke of their pride in my accomplishments, conveniently omitting the fact that they'd likely read about them in a newspaper. "We made a terrible mistake, Emma," Richard said, leaning forward, his voice low and confidential. "We were in a difficult place. My business was struggling. We thought you'd have a better life with a family that could offer more stability." It was a lie, and we all knew it. Their finances had been perfectly stable. The only thing that had changed was their access to Isabella's fortune. Then came the first probe. "This magnificent foundation you've built," Margaret said, her eyes gleaming. "It must be so rewarding, but also such a burden, all those financial decisions. Richard has such a brilliant mind for investments. Perhaps he could offer some guidance. As your father, he would only want to help you protect your assets. I just smiled, a cool, non-committal expression I had perfected in board meetings. The foundation has a very capable board of directors, but I appreciate the offer. Their smiles tightened. We were sparring, and they were just beginning to realize I wasn't the same player they had faced before. Peterson's initial report came in a week later, and it was exactly what I expected, only worse. Richard's investment firm had collapsed 5 years prior due to a series of reckless, high-risk trades. They were drowning in debt. They had remortgaged their house to the hilt and were months away from foreclosure. Several of Richard's former clients were threatening legal action. Their respectable facade was a hollow shell, and they were desperate. This wasn't just about wanting more money, this was about survival. Their outreach to me wasn't born of regret, it was a last-ditch, high-stakes gamble. The report also contained a detail that made my blood run cold. Pete. Arson had discovered emails between them from 6 months ago, discussing their Emma strategy. They had researched me extensively, mapping out my emotional weak spots, debating the best way to approach me to maximize their chances of a payout. They had even drafted versions of the letter they sent me. This was a premeditated campaign. The knowledge settled in me, cold and heavy. Any lingering flicker of doubt, any small, foolish hope that there might be a kernel of truth to their remorse was extinguished. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a solution to their problems, a walking, talking bank account. I thought of the Millers, my real parents, who were due back from their cruise in a few days. They had given me love without condition, celebrating me for who I was, not what I had. The contrast was a chasm. My resolve hardened into steel. They had started this war, but I was going to finish it. And thanks to Aunt Isabella, I had the perfect weapon to do so. With Peterson's report burning a hole in my digital files, I knew my next move had to be precise. A full-scale confrontation wasn't the right play yet. I needed to corner them, to make them reveal their hand in a way that couldn't be denied. I called them and arranged to meet at their home, feigning a desire to see where I grew up. The suggestion was met with delighted, almost giddy agreement. They thought their strategy was working. They thought I was softening. Driving to their house in the suburbs felt like traveling back in time. It was the same immaculate brick colonial, the same perfectly manicured lawn. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. I was no longer the powerless child walking through that door, but a woman in complete control of the situation. Margaret greeted me at the door with a hug that felt like a cage. Richard stood behind her, beaming, the perfect image of a proud father. They led me into the living room, the same cold, formal space I remembered. They had prepared tea and a plate of store-bought cookies. The entire scene was a stage, and they were the lead actors. We engaged in pleasantries for a few minutes. I let them guide the conversation, listening to their carefully curated stories of the past 19 years, tales of modest successes and minor setbacks, with no mention of the impending financial ruin that Peterson's report had detailed. Finally, I decided it was time to disrupt the performance. I took a sip of my tea and looked at Richard directly. "It must have been so difficult for you when your firm closed down," I said, my tone sympathetic and casual. The effect was instantaneous. Richard's smile froze on his face. Margaret's hand, which was reaching for a cookie, stopped midair. The air in the room crackled with sudden tension. I'm not sure what you mean," Richard stammered, his composure shattering. "My firm didn't close. I retired, decided to take a step back, manage our personal portfolio." "Oh, I must have been misinformed," I said, feigning innocence. "I heard there were some unfortunate market turns, and some very unhappy investors. It sounded incredibly stressful, especially with the bank threatening to foreclose on this beautiful house." Margaret shot a panicked look at her husband. "Who told you these outrageous lies?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave. The mask of the gentle, remorseful mother had slipped, revealing the sharp, avaricious face beneath. "A concerned party," I said vaguely, keeping my gaze locked on Richard. The point is, I understand you're in a difficult position. It must be why you reached out. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. The facade of the loving father evaporated, replaced by the bitter, resentful man I remembered from my childhood. And what if we are? He snapped. After everything we gave you, the best schools, the best clothes, is it so wrong to expect a little gratitude? A little help for the parents who brought you into this world. That money, Isabella's money, it should have been ours. It was our birthright, and she gave it to a child. The venom in his voice was raw, unfiltered. This was the truth. This was the real reason they had cast me out. It was never about my well-being. It was about their wounded pride, their thwarted greed. Margaret, realizing her husband had just made a catastrophic error, tried to jump in. "Richard, darling, you're upset. That's not what we meant, Emma, we just..." But the damage was done. They had revealed themselves. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding what they believed was theirs. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. "Thank you for the tea," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And thank you for your honesty. You've made the situation much clearer." Their immediate reaction was to lash out with poorly executed threats. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Richard sneered. "Living in your ivory tower, judging us. We are your parents. We have rights. There are laws." Who would be very interested to hear how a little girl was turned against her own flesh and blood. It was exactly what I needed. A threat. An open admission of their intent. I had recorded the entire conversation on my phone. I didn't respond to his outburst. I simply walked to the door, my composure unnerving them more than any shouting match could. As I left, I heard Margaret's frantic hissing, "Richard, you fool, you've ruined everything." Driving away, I felt no triumph, only a profound and hollow sadness. I had hoped in some small, naive corner of my heart that I was wrong, that there might be some sliver of genuine regret in them, but there was nothing. Only a desperate, ugly hunger for money they felt they were owed. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it completely. My parents, my adoptive parents, David and Sarah, returned from their cruise to a daughter who was quieter, her smiles a little more strained. I sat them down in their warm, cozy living room, the scent of cedar from my father's workshop hanging in the air, and told them everything. The letter, the phone calls, my meeting with the Sterlings, and the existence of the prodigal clause. My mother, Sarah, listened with a fierce, protective anger in her eyes. My father, David, simply reached out and took my hand, his calloused palm a familiar comfort. When I finished, he squeezed my hand tightly. "They're not your family, Emma," he said, his voice firm. "We are, and we will not let them hurt you again." Their unwavering support was the anchor I needed. With them beside me, the path forward became clear. Richard and Margaret, reeling from their blunder, went quiet for a few days. Then, their counterattack began. It was clumsy but vicious. I started getting calls from distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in 2 decades. The story was always the same. Richard and Margaret had called them, weeping, telling them how their estranged daughter, poisoned by her adoptive family, had reappeared only to cruelly taunt them with her wealth. They painted me as a cold, ungrateful heiress and themselves as heartbroken victims. It was a classic manipulation tactic, an attempt to isolate me and use family pressure as a weapon. For a moment, it stung. But then Peterson's final report landed in my inbox, and the sting was replaced by a cold fury. The investigator had dug deeper, uncovering a pattern of behavior that was even worse than I had imagined. Richard's business hadn't just failed. He had been accused of defrauding several elderly clients, convincing them to invest in shell companies. He had avoided prosecution only because the clients, embarrassed and lacking concrete proof, had dropped their cases. Furthermore, Peterson had found a former neighbor of the Sterlings who was willing to speak. She remembered the period after Isabella's death clearly. She recalled Margaret complaining loudly at a neighborhood barbecue that they had been robbed by a 10-year-old and were looking for ways to fix the situation. The most damning piece of evidence was a copy of a loan application Richard had submitted 3 months ago. In the section for anticipated future income, he had brazenly written, "Significant family inheritance, currently in negotiation." They hadn't just been planning this for 6 months. They had been counting on it, borrowing against a fantasy of my capitulation. This was premeditated, calculated, and utterly contemptible. My conversation with them, where Richard had threatened legal action, was the final piece I needed. Their attempts to slander me to family members constituted public defamation. Their loan application showed clear financial intent. They had, by their own actions, fulfilled every condition of the prodigal clause. My lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, agreed. "It's airtight, Emma," he said, his voice grimly satisfied. "They've walked right into the trap Isabella set for them. The question now is not if we can trigger the clause, but when and how." The answer to that question came in the form of a registered letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was a formal invitation. Richard and Margaret Sterling requested my presence at a family reconciliation dinner to be held at a private room in an upscale restaurant in 2 weeks' time. They had invited the entire extended family, the same relatives they had been poisoning against me. The strategy was obvious. It was a public ambush. They intended to put me on the spot in a room full of people they had primed with their sob story and pressure me into a public commitment of financial support. They believed my aversion to a scene would make me fold. It was their final, desperate move. "It's a perfect stage," I told Mr. Abernathy over the phone. "For them or for you?" he asked. "For both of us," I replied, a hard smile touching my lips. "They want a public showdown. I think it's time we gave them one." The evening of the family reconciliation dinner was cold and clear. I wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress, an outfit that projected quiet confidence. My parents, David and Sarah, flanked me as we walked into the restaurant. Their presence was my silent, unshakable support system. The private dining room was filled with faces I barely recognized, aunts, uncles, and cousins from the Sterling side of my lineage. They watched me with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. Richard and Margaret stood near the head of the long table, masters of ceremony in their own drama. Margaret rushed forward to greet me, her arms outstretched. "Emma, darling, you came. We were so worried." Her voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. I accepted her brittle hug and moved past her, greeting the other relatives with polite nods. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. We took our seats, and a painful, stilted dinner service began. Richard and Margaret kept up a running commentary about their boundless love for me, their deep regret, and their hope for a future where their family was whole again. It was a nauseatingly brilliant performance. Finally, after dessert was served, Richard stood, tapping his glass for attention. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat, his expression a carefully crafted mask of sorrow and paternal love. "Family," he began, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. "Thank you all for being here. This is a momentous night. For 19 years, there has been a hole in our hearts, a void left when circumstances forced us to make the most difficult decision of our lives. But now, our daughter, Emma, has returned to us." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words settle. "We have watched her grow from afar, so proud of the incredible woman she has become, building a legacy of charity with the resources our dear Aunt Isabella left her. But we have also seen the burden she carries, and as her parents, we want to help. We want to be involved, to offer our guidance, our expertise, to help her manage this great responsibility." He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with false sincerity. "Emma, your mother and I want to propose a formal reconciliation. We ask you, in front of our family, to finally heal this wound. We ask for you to provide for us, your loving parents, so we can dedicate our lives to helping you and being the family we were always meant to be. A simple trust, a gesture of goodwill, is all we ask." The room was utterly still. Every eye was on me. This was the moment of their imagined triumph, the public pressure cooker designed to make me break. I took a sip of water, my hand perfectly steady. Then I stood up. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. "Thank you for making your intentions so public. It's incredibly helpful." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small stack of papers held together by a binder clip. "You speak of family, of burdens, and of Aunt Isabella's legacy," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I agree, we should talk about her legacy. Specifically, the legal document she left behind. Most of you know she left her fortune in a trust for me, but you probably don't know about a special provision she included, a very specific one regarding my biological parents. Mr. Abernathy, her lawyer, called it the prodigal clause." I saw a flash of genuine panic in Richard's eyes. Margaret went pale. "This clause," I explained, letting my gaze drift over the watching faces, "was designed to protect me. It states that if Richard or Margaret Sterling were ever to coerce me, defame me, or attempt to manipulate me for financial gain, the trust would be authorized to permanently sever all ties and, if necessary, make the reasons for that severance public." I let that sink in. Then I held up the papers. "This is a report from a private investigator. It details Richard's failed business, his fraudulent activities, and the fact that this house is in foreclosure. It also includes a copy of a loan application where he listed my inheritance as anticipated income." I placed the first set of papers on the table. "This," I said, holding up a second document, "is a transcript of a recorded conversation in which Richard threatened me with legal action if I did not give him money, after admitting his sole motivation was resentment over the inheritance." I placed it next to the first. "And these," I said, fanning out several printed emails, "are sworn statements from family members whom Richard and Margaret have been calling for weeks, slandering me as a cruel and ungrateful daughter in a clear attempt to pressure me. An act of public defamation." A collective gasp went through the room. The faces staring at me were no longer judgmental, but shocked. "You didn't come back for a daughter," I said, my voice ringing with 19 years of buried pain and newfound strength. "You came back for a bailout. You abandoned a child because she was a girl who inherited a fortune you felt entitled to. And now you've tried to manipulate and threaten your way into that fortune because your own greed has ruined you. You have, by your own actions, triggered every single condition of the prodigal clause." I looked at Richard and Margaret. Their faces were masks of horror. They were exposed, utterly and completely. "So, to answer your request," I said, my voice dropping to a steely, final tone, "no, you will not get a dime, but I will be sending you a copy of the legal notice from the Trust's board. Consider our relationship and any hope you had of touching Isabella's legacy permanently terminated." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at me, his mouth agape. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. Then my father, my real father, David Miller, stood up and put a proud, steadying hand on my shoulder. The spell was broken. The showdown was over, and I had won. The fallout from the dinner was immediate and catastrophic for the Sterlings. The carefully constructed world of respectability they had built around themselves shattered in a single evening. Murmurs and whispers followed them as they made a hasty, humiliated exit from the restaurant. The extended family, armed with the undeniable truth, turned their backs on them completely. The public shaming they had planned for me had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The following Monday, Mr. Abernathy and the Foundation's legal team formally invoked the prodigal clause. A fleet of couriers delivered cease and desist letters and official notifications of the Trust's action to Richard and Margaret, their lawyer, and the bank holding their mortgage. The documents legally barred them from ever contacting me again or making any claim, however frivolous, against the estate. As per the clause, a carefully worded but unambiguous statement was also released to their former business associates and the heads of the social clubs Margaret frequented, explaining that, due to actions of a manipulative and coercive nature, the Sterling Trust had formally severed all association with them. Their financial ruin was swift. Without the fantasy of my anticipated income, their loans were called in. The foreclosure on their house proceeded. The investors Richard had swindled, emboldened by his public disgrace, refiled their lawsuits, this time as a group. Their downfall was total, a direct consequence of a lifetime of greed. I felt no joy in their destruction, only a quiet, somber sense of justice. It was the outcome they had written for themselves. In the weeks that followed, a profound sense of peace settled over me, a peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The ghosts of my past had been faced and vanquished. The wound of my abandonment, while still a part of my story, no longer had the power to hurt me. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was at home in the comfortable house I shared with my 2 golden retrievers, sitting with my parents, David and Sarah. We were looking through old photo albums, laughing at pictures of me with braces and my father with a truly questionable mustache in the 90s. "We were so proud of you that night, Emma," my mom said softly, her eyes shining. "Not because you won, but because you stood up for yourself, for the little girl they left behind." My dad nodded, his expression serious. "Isabella would have been proud, too. You used the tools she gave you not for revenge, but for justice, and to protect the good work you do." He was right. The foundation was my true inheritance. It was the living, breathing embodiment of my gray tant's belief in me. The next day, I announced a new major initiative at the foundation: the Isabella Sterling Grant for Girls in Entrepreneurship, a program specifically designed to fund and mentor young women with bold ideas, the kind of women my biological parents would never have understood or valued. As I stood before my team, outlining the program, I felt the last vestiges of the Sterling's shadow lift from my life. They had seen me as a placeholder for a fortune. Aunt Isabella had seen me as a worthy successor. My parents, the Millers, had seen me simply as their daughter. And finally, I was able to see myself as all three: a responsible steward, a loving daughter, and a strong, resilient woman, finally free.